Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the 97 UX Things podcast. This is Dan Berlin, your host. And today I am joined with Jon Robinson, who is principal in experience strategy and design at Slalom Consulting. And he's here to talk about his chapter, Embrace Your Ignorance, today. Welcome, Jon.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Nice to meet you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. And thanks for coming on the podcast and for writing your chapter. Can you please take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so like you said, I'm a principal in our experience strategy and design group in Slalom, in our based out of St. Louis, in our St. Louis office. We are a global consulting firm that has like 35 to 40-ish locations worldwide. Our St. Louis office has been around for something like 4 years or so now. We have a pretty robust experience strategy and design group. I think there are about 25 to 30 of us, something like that.
Hmm.
And so we kind of, I always describe our team as like about half of us are designers, half of us are researchers, strategists. Few of us can kind of lean both ways and do both. But we do a lot of like agile product development, customer experience, service design, really any kind of problem that can be solved with a
Hmm.
human-centered approach to design. So.
Great. Are there any domains that you tend to work in or particularly like working in? Industries
Yeah,
or verticals?
just about anything. Recently, healthcare is something I've kind of been drawn to as in terms of an industry. Mainly because my wife, I've been like a partner to my wife on this long healthcare journey over the last several years, and I've spent a lot of time in doctors' offices and hospitals, and a lot of time kind of reflecting and going, well,
Mm,
that could be a lot better. And
right.
so that's something I've been drawn to a little more the last few years. I've been lucky enough to work with a few healthcare clients and focus on those types of problems. So that's been really nice.
Hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
great. And can you tell us about your career trajectory, where you started off and how you wound up where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a bit of a UX transplant. I
Mm,
think I would describe it as. My background. I come from the design side, really the creative agency world for the most part. Like most designers, I went through a traditional graphic design program, rooted in like the fine arts school at a small college in Central Illinois. Illinois Wesleyan University. I actually taught there as well after I finished grad school. And I've been teaching design for about 7 years, as kind of like not a side hustle necessarily, but just something I've kind of been passionate about. And,
sure.
and one of the main reasons I actually back to school to get a graduate degree was because I wanted to teach. It was more of like a qualification that I wanted, a box I wanted to check, I guess, to
Mm,
a degree. And I just recently have decided to kind of take a bit of a break from teaching just because I've been doing it for 7 or so years. And it's tough. It's tough to balance it with, being busy with work and teaching
right.
online in an entire online environment for the last year and a half has really changed, the way that I can approach it. But going back to where we started, yeah, so it was interesting because I always took art classes in high school, and I didn't really know much about design. It was kind of a fledgling thing to me, and originally I wanted to be a broadcaster. I wanted to go into communications,
Hmm.
because being from the St. Louis area, guys like Jack Buck and Bob Costas were like just as big as other sports heroes, around here. And
Yep.
so like, oh, I wanted to do that. And luckily I had a high school guidance counselor that was like, aren't you really good at art? And I said, yeah. And he's like, maybe you should do art. I was like, oh, I guess you're right. And that was pretty much how that happened. And when I got to school, as an art student, I saw like, wow, you can do art on computers, and that's kind of what drew me to design. And
Yeah.
and I definitely want to talk about that whole concept later. But I started as a print designer, eventually kind of moved into the agency world, did a lot of branding, did a lot of consumer like packaged goods design, and designed my first website. My first like legitimate website, right?
Yep.
I took some web design classes back when I was in college where we like designed everything in Photoshop and sliced it up and exported it. Not real web design, as at least the way that most people would think of it today. Um,
1.0.
yeah, early web. So yeah, so I kind of just I made that transition from like primarily a brand designer to a consumer packaged goods designer to a little bit of a UX designer, but not quite, because it was more in the marketing creative agency world. It was very
Mm,
focused on, like making pretty things, and not really focused on metrics or solving bigger problems. I always say that, like, in that world, we treated things like that more like projects than products,
hmm,
right? And you kind of approached each one as an individual thing in itself, and once you were done with it and you launched a website, you kind of moved on to the next thing.
right.
And I eventually learned that there's a better way, and that's kind of how I made my transition over to UX.
Excellent. So thanks for that. So how did you get into UX?
Yeah. So I kind of, I loved the design world, and all the, work I had done in the agency world. I kind of started to think, I looked at my portfolio and I said to myself, like, I'm really happy. I've made a lot of great work that I'm really proud of, but I started to question the value of it, and I always tell people that, I used to like use design to sell products, and now I use it to solve problems, which has like
Mm,
this much higher inherent value in it. I used to like design for people, and now I design with people. And I started to think about things like that, like what's really important to me. And that's kind of what won out. But I actually there was kind of like a moment where I realized that it was time for me to. I'd been interested, right, in user experience for a while, and I didn't really know exactly what all that was. And I read and read, and by the way, like, if you're looking to get into anything new, reading about it, talking to people about it, by far
hmm.
the best way to kind of self-educate yourself on things.
Absolutely.
And I remember that I had designed a website several years prior. And just like what I was saying, it was very much treated by the client like, okay, we're done with this thing. It's out there now in the world, and we'll just let it like take care of itself. And we could
Yep.
never convince anyone to do anything. And they came back to us like 4 years later, and they wanted to make some content updates. And nothing had changed with this thing that we had like designed and launched out into the world in 4 years. We set it out with, like, I think it had like 3 blog posts on it or something, and 4 years
Right.
later it was like the same 3 blog posts. Nothing had changed. And that to me was like this kind of like part one of a turning point of like, what am I doing here? Am I really making anything that's helping anybody or solving any problems? And the bigger thing was, which really leads into the topic that I covered in my chapter, was I felt like the agency world was so focused on this the client is always right mentality, and trying to make the client happy, right? Because they're the ones paying for the work, that the idea of asking questions was more and more often being discouraged. And I was actually working on a project for a big box store. It was Costco or Sam's Club, or one of those two. And you know how like the stuff is all in these big cardboard boxes, and when a box is empty, they rip the top
Yeah.
off of another
Yep.
cardboard box, right? And
For
was it,
display.
yeah, for the displays. And I was designing like one of those cardboard boxes, and the client came back and wanted some revisions and said, like, we have data that shows X works better or
Yeah.
whatnot. And I said, well, that's not a problem, but like, let's ask them to send that data. I'd like to see that data. And I was told, like, no, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to
Hmm.
do what they want. And I said, from my opinion, I'm like, I'm not arguing. I just want to see the data, right? And I was like, no, 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 we're definitely not going to do that. Um, so that for me was the idea that, not asking questions with the intent to form a larger or just a more valuable understanding around the reasons
Hmm.
behind the decisions that we were making.
Yep.
That for me was like, well, it's time for something different, because this is no longer aligning with really the way that I think or the way that I want to work or the type of work I want to do as just a person in general.
Yep. And not asking questions, it only not only limits the reasons, but also the possibilities, right? When it comes to the design, if you can't ask questions, that limits your possibilities.
Exactly. Yeah. I say, like, it makes you very inflexible,
Hmm.
right? It leaves things very inflexible. So I started having conversations with Slalom. I was really interested in, we were kind of, locally building up this team. And on my first day, I spoke to our general manager at the time and I told her that exact story. And she kind of pointed at me and she was like, I have a challenge for you. I don't want you to ever stop asking questions.
Right.
I want you to
Great.
ask every question you think of, no matter how dumb you might think it is. And that's, like I'm charging you with this.
Yep.
And that's kind of the point where I felt like, well, I'm not only in the right place, but I think I've made the right move to the right industry.
Yep.
So
No, absolutely. That's one of my favorites too. It's right. We're always asking questions. Everything's always changing. That means we always have to continue asking questions. It's what we do.
yeah, 100%.
So that actually sounds like it led into your chapter. That sounds the way
Yes.
you got here sounds very similar to your chapter, embracing your ignorance. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I start the chapter off with this idea, like kind of formulated, and I marinated on it for a while, and then I was reading this book by Neil deGrasse Tyson called Astrophysics for People in a Hurry.
Mm,
I'm sure I think it's one of his like more popular digestible books, and in it
yep.
he said, um, "Ignorance is the natural state of mind for a research scientist." And for me, that was kind of like it clicked, right? It resonated almost immediately. And so I started using that in talks when I was, at conferences or talking to students about the field. And the more I kind of thought about it, like I also made this connection to the Socratic paradox, which is something like the only like real or the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing,
Right. Right.
right? And that kind of set me
Very
down this
zen.
whole path. Go ahead, sorry.
I said very zen.
Yes, yes, and I'm not really like a Zen type of person, but for me, that was, you know, very much like it is deep. I thought like, wow, that's actually really cool, but not a lot of people. That's not something that would resonate with a lot of people, right?
Mm,
The idea that you can be comfortable with not knowing something, or that you can really, embrace the concept of saying, I don't have all the answers.
hmm
Especially, when I was a young designer starting out, like I thought I knew everything and I thought I always would. And I also thought that that was part of what I was supposed to be, like who I was supposed to be or what I was supposed to do as a professional was have all the answers,
hmm
you know?
hmm
Especially when you work with clients and you're trying to like convince people that you should come want to work with us, or the ideas that we have are like very solid and profound, and you're trying to sell people on things. But if it's not informed by anything other than like the way that you think about it personally, then you're just wasting your time, right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I kind of like, I've always been the type of person who wants to understand things. When I was a kid, my my grandmother owned a light fixture store, and I would hang out there in the summers, and she would give me like boxes full of parts, like electrical parts, and I would try to take things apart and put them back together. Every time I got like a stereo or something, I always wanted to like rip it apart and see if I could figure out how to reassemble it. So that kind of combined with like an inherent need to, to get deeper on things. And it's like every time you use the Coca-Cola freestyle machine and you wonder like, man, how does my root beer not taste like orange soda? Like how does it how does this thing work? Um, so for me, then it just became like, I'm never going to be afraid to ask questions any longer.
hmm
Right.
hmm It's actually came up in the previous episode about humbling oneself,
Yeah.
especially in UX, and very similar here, where one has to humble themselves in order to embrace the ignorance. Any tips for folks in terms of how to do that?
Yeah, and I kind of like tend to call it like practicing constructive ignorance. I
Mm,
don't know. I didn't necessarily. I don't know if I coined that term or if it makes any sense, but that's just the way that I describe it. And yeah, a few of the like key, actionable ways that I point out of how you can support this idea is, kind of what you said, like finding courage to explore things that you don't know, or finding like joy in wanting to understand things at a deeper level, right? Going back to that the reason I start off with this whole quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson is, for me, UX research is a science. Um, and here I talk about how all my background is from the design world. So for me, I'm constantly trying to beef up more and balance the art and the science in my own practice. Treating UX research like a science, it's more important to like approach problems with no hypothesis, right? And really
Mm,
understand that the goal of an experiment isn't to try to predict the outcome. You're not trying to validate
yep.
something that you think is going to happen, but it's really that like you want to answer something that you can't predict. You
Right.
just want to know the answer,
Hmm.
right? Um, and
I guess I'll throw out a caveat there, though,
yeah,
to play devil's advocate. Totally agree in terms of more formative and even evaluative work and research. But when it comes to summative at the end, I think we do want some hypothesis of, okay, at a summative study, a summative usability study, for example, our hypothesis is that there's going to be zero friction in this
hmm
experience.
hmm
That's the one devil's advocate-y thing I can think of there.
yeah, certainly, and then that's okay, right? Like you also have to be okay with the fact that if you did have an assumption to begin with and you find out that you were totally wrong, you have to be accepting of that and say like,
Love
okay,
it.
it's time to pivot, right? Yeah.
Yep.
And last is like, which really plays off of that is instead of trying to validate assumptions and like whether it's your assumptions or someone else's assumptions, like you really want to challenge those assumptions,
Yep.
which goes right back to me wanting to see that data from Costco or wherever it was, right? So,
So, any tips there? So, this is something I do hear from folks in terms of convincing folks, and being able to ask those questions, and dealing with the hippo, the highest paid person in the room.
yeah.
Any tips on enabling humbleness in others, and having others embrace their ignorance?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, that's really where this comes from a lot of the time is everyone who's listening has probably at some point been in a room with a larger number of people and they've thought, am I the only one who doesn't understand what's being talked about or discussed here?
Mm,
Right. Was everyone else seems to like just be nodding their heads and saying, yes, this is perfect. We all get it. And you're kind of thinking to yourself, like, am I just not getting it? Or is really no one else like, well, you're probably not the only one. But yeah, how do you convince yourself that it's okay to be the person to speak up and say, I'm sorry,
yep.
but I've got a few questions here. They may be stupid questions. They may be obvious questions. Um, but that is a tough thing to do. And I don't know that I necessarily have any advice for someone like if you're the type of person who's scared to ask that question, other than don't be afraid to ask that question.
Yep.
Because it's very likely that as soon as you do, you're gonna have someone else speak up and say like, I've been wondering this too. You'll see another hand or two raise. It's for me, it's a valuable tactic to just say like, okay, I'm going to ask a couple obvious questions here just because I want to make sure
Yep.
that we're all on the same page. And approaching it from like a collective understanding, I think is maybe a little bit of an easier way to get other people on board.
Yeah, no,
Mm.
absolutely. And something I always tell folks is that, if you think that you are the only person in the room thinking something, you're probably not.
Mhm.
There's always folks, whose minds are aligned. Also, when you do ask that question, you open up the door for others to to ask the questions that they may have.
Yeah.
So you're enabling others. So yeah, I agree. Just like ask your questions. I love it.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
Great. So this has been wonderful. So, and actually, this has all been full of advice in terms of how to embrace your ignorance and chat with others about it. Last part of the episode we'd like to do is giving that piece of advice.
Yeah.
So, is there another piece of advice that you'd like to convey to folks?
Yeah, it's a bit of a two-parter, and it mainly comes from the fact that or it comes from my time, teaching design students for the last several years, and the first thing, like night one, that I usually have to kind of try to communicate to all my students So this is like design advice, right? Is you're not an artist. And that's something that a lot of young designers, people breaking into this field kind of struggle with concept wise.
Hmm.
A lot of designers consider themselves artists. They might practice art in their own time. So I'm not trying to offend anyone. But like I said earlier, design programs are often rooted in the fine arts world, right? And students kind of come to this with foundational art understanding, painting classes, drawing classes, and like I said, when I have a new group of students come in, the first thing that I really try to communicate to them is like design and art, they share similar qualities, but they're two fundamentally different disciplines.
Hmm.
And a lot of people think that it's kind of a fine line, but I think it's more of like a colossal gap, really. A lot of art is about the artist, design is about the audience or the user, and that's, I think, like something that all of us need to understand on the
Yeah.
UX side, right? Art's subjective, design is objective. Art expresses creativity, design leverages creativity, and like we can go on and on and on about that. But I think that anyone who's like looking to get into either the design practice or UX in any way, who is interested in design, needs to just understand that people will call you an artist. They will praise how pretty and beautiful the things are that you make. And it's okay to educate people otherwise, that, this is a goal-based practice, right?
Yep.
And kind of point number two off of that is that all designers start as copycats. I always say this: all designers
Yep.
start as copycats, and that is okay.
Yep.
And some of the worst advice that I got when I was young was someone who I trusted, because he seemed very successful to me, told me, "Don't go look at the work that other people are producing." And it took me a long time to realize like that was very bad advice, right? Like you
Yeah.
have to be aware of what your contemporaries are doing. You have to be aware of common patterns and expectations that people have from products they use. And
You need
it's
that
really like,
inspiration. Yeah.
yeah, it's not just inspiration, but for understanding too.
Mm.
Like understanding what works and what doesn't work. And it's like the same way that when I was a kid, I learned to draw by copying drawings or tracing over drawings.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of us would likely never stand up and take steps if we never saw anybody else do it.
Right. Right.
Right? Like that's an inherent human thing that we learn by seeing others do something and copying that. So, an important part of like growing an expertise in anything is learning to see problems through the eyes of an expert. And so I encourage anyone who wants to design, mobile applications or websites or anything else, the posters, it doesn't matter what it is. It's okay to go out there and feed, yourself with as much as you can find. And it's okay to copy those things. Just don't put them in your portfolio.
Right.
Copying is a
Right.
personal exercise for learning and growing. So,
Yep. Great. Well, thanks for all of that
yeah,
advice. This chat has been full of advice, whether it's in terms of career trajectory and humbling oneself and art and design. So that's wonderful. Thanks for that, Sean.
thank you.
So that'll wrap it up for this episode. And thanks again to Jon Robinson for coming in and discussing his chapter, Embrace Your Ignorance.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening in, everyone. You've been listening to the 97 UX Things podcast, a companion to the book 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know, published by O'Reilly and available at your local bookshop. All book royalties go to UX nonprofits, as will any funds raised by this podcast. The theme music is Moisturize the Situation by Consider the Source. Joshua Berlin is the podcast transcript editor, and I'm your host and book editor, Dan Berlin. Please remember to find the needs in your community and fill them with your best work. Thanks for listening.